Thank you for joining us as we review the Republican leadership budget. The reason that we're providing our own address or addressing this budget is because we were not able to participate with the co-chairs in developing the co-chairs budget. It worked so well in 2011 to 2012 to have Republicans and Democrats working together to solve problems that were bipartisan. That hasn't happened today, and so now we have to deal with first a turning point without knowing which way we're turning, and it makes certain assumptions that we're going to have to deal with. Understand the budget that was proposed just 2 hours ago assumes that the subcommittees will come up with between $150 and $200 million of reductions that are undisclosed. It assumes that there will be tax increases on Oregon businesses and families by changing the tax code of $275 million. And it assumes that the PERS board will accept a request to lower the PERS assessments by 1.9%, which is about $350 million. Now that's some real assumptions. You take those assumptions away, and do you really have a balanced budget? On the other hand, the Oregon Republican leadership budget is based on a long-term view on what will put Oregon on a path to prosperity. It assumes that we will have the ability to rein in outrageous spending that cannot be sustained. It assumes that we will realign that spending so that we're not continuing to favor certain programs at the expense of our kids and their education. And it assumes that we will reserve funds during times of economic recovery. I mean, the budget that we have in 2011-13 has been 10% higher than the prior budget. The proposed forecast for the next 2 years is also 10% higher. That's $1.7 billion of additional revenue expected in 2013-15 over what we've had in the current biennium. And so it's important that we realign, that we rein in, and that we reserve funds. Senator.
Thank you. Once again, thank you for being here this afternoon. Our government in Oregon has plenty of cash. What we have not had is the will to live within our means. We have more general fund money to spend today than we have ever had before. In fact, the projected general fund for 13-15 is about $1.7 billion, more than the current biennium. That calculates to about $400 per every man, woman, and child in the state of Oregon. That's an increase of $400 per person. Regardless of that huge increase in revenue, Oregon government has continued to borrow. In the last 10 years, our total taxpayer obligated debt has increased nearly exponentially. The principal and interest payments on all that debt has reached nearly 5% of general fund and nearly 25% of lottery revenue. We must pay more than $600 million during the 2013-15 biennium just to make the payments on all this debt. That is $600 million that cannot be used to hire teachers and firefighters and policemen and other essential employees. Our obligation to make these payments will continue until all that debt is paid off. Our Republican budget is designed to reverse these unsustainable trends. Our budget is intended to live within our means, reduce borrowing, pay down debt, and slow the rate of government growth. In contrast, the co-chair's budget released this morning begins with a $245 million ending balance and appears to end in a $200 million deficit. Their budget appears to use about $450 million more than the revenue stream in Oregon will bring in this year. Dennis?
Thank you. So when we talk about reining in unsustainable spending, I mean, what are we really talking about? If you look back to 2005, from 2005 to 2011, the spending on human services went up 44%. The spending on K-12 education went up 7.7%. And so these are decisions that have been made. We do not have unlimited amounts of funds. To make this more visually clear, if you look at at this chart, you'll see the increase in spending as part of the general fund's budget. So from 0305, the Human Services was taking less than 21% of our general fund budget. But if you now look at what it was in 1113, you see that it is at 26%. All right, so how can it take that higher percentage? I mean, where's the money coming from? There were tax increases, as we know, but those tax increases did not make up the difference. So what we really have is we can make a comparison between those same periods of time on the percentage of the budget that went to K-12. So why are we in an education crisis in our state? Back in 0305, over 44% of the budget went to K-12 education. Take a look at it now, 1113, and it's down to 38%. And so we're placing the expansion of social programs on the backs of the education for our children. Our budget seeks to change that allocation and start a trend back upward, giving greater revenue and greater percentage of revenue to K-12 education. In addition, we have the PERS issue. I mean, the cost of PERS went up $1.1 billion in the current biennium. I mean, that's on top of everything else. It's just like a debt. It's forecast that in the next 2 years, it's going to go up $906 million more. And if nothing's done, the forecast for the following 2015-17 budget is to go up another $678 million. This is like additional loans that have to be paid. It comes off of the top. Every $44 million in a biennium buys a day of school. Every $90,000 to $100,000 a year pays for a teacher. And so if we do not reinvest in education, we will continue to have expanding size of classrooms, reductions in the number of days of actual education being taught, and the cutting of additional teachers. So our budget assumes that we have to make a rational adjustment in PERS, not something to just make it look like you're doing something to reform PERS that actually will save less than the cost of just the increases in the next 2 years, but meaningful PERS reform. Fortunately, as you are aware, Senate Bill 754 came out last week, and this is the Oregon State Board Association's recommendations for PERS reform. We embrace those recommendations. We think, finally, there's a rational approach. And if we take a look at what that really means for education and compare it to what is being proposed, here's what we'll see. Let me put these down. We're proposing that K-12 budget have $7.15 billion, including the PERS reforms. Now that is a 25% increase. Do you get a 25% increase in K-12 education in one biennium? I mean, normally I'd be the one to say that is ridiculous. I mean, that's too much. Except that when you look at what happened over the last 3 or 4 biennia and you see this reduction in percentage of funding going to K-12, there has to be an adjustment. And so this adjustment would allow, and notice that the difference between what is proposed by the co-chairs and ours, we are at $6.55 billion in hard dollars. They actually came in at that same figure. And so then the difference is what can you really have with your PERS savings? At $7.15 billion, we have $600 million of additional resources that will be used for K-12, and a dollar saved that you don't have to spend on PERS is a dollar that can be used elsewhere. The co-chair's budget talks about $200 million. But what's really important is how will it not just affect the current biennium, but the next one, and the next one after that, and the next one after that. The governor said we should be looking at a 10-year budgeting term and look ahead. That's what we intend to do by reining in these expenses, by realigning our priorities so that we can invest in education and bring down the continual unsustainable investments that we're making in human services. In the health authority, two years ago, the governor promised us that we would be able to lower the increase in health costs to 4%. I mean, that was wonderful. That got the seed money that we needed from the federal government for our health transformation. We think that that is a good percentage, and that's a percentage we ought to use. That's stay within those projections that we received 2 years ago. And so we have the ability to reinvest in our education. Now, what about reserves? The reserves are vitally important. Do you realize that if there was a moderate recession in 2015, it would lower the forecast for 2015-17 by $900 million. Instead of spending everything you've got and basing your spending on tax increases that you don't have the votes to get, why not say, look, when we're increasing by $1.7 billion, maybe we should put part of the money that we are, this increase in revenue, into the rainy day fund. So we propose off the top that $100 million go to the rainy day fund. And then you look beyond that and you say, so what about education? We've already talked about that. With the PERS savings, we're at 25% increase. Without the PERS savings, we're at 14% reinvestment. What does that mean? It means fewer kids in a classroom. It means having the ability to hire more teachers, and it means having a longer school year so that we can work toward accomplishing this goal that we should all have of having our Oregon students receive a 21st century education that will help them be competitive not only with adjoining states but with any school district or school education system in the world. So with that, we'd like to take any questions you might have.
How do you get to your PERS savings? The higher figure, the $600 million? PERS reform? The
Oregon School Boards Association bill, and it's being actually recalculated to the dollar, but as we look at what has been given from other PERS documents, the total savings is estimated between $1.8 and $2 billion. That's where we think that the final workup is going to come in. And of that amount, if it's 1.8, education is worth about a third of that. And so there's your $600 million.
But I'm sorry, to get to the 1.8, is it just you put the cost of COLA caps at a lower?
There are actually several features to that bill. One is the first two are similar to the governor's plan of reducing capping the COLA at $24,000 and taking back the out-of-state compensation for PERS retirees. There's also a provision that will try to reduce the spiking of salaries toward the end of their career, and there's a fourth thing that redirects the employee contributions from individual retirement accounts for Tier 1 and Tier 2 employees. That will save about over $1 billion. And it also
with the final figures, we'll know.
Yeah, about that. I'm advisedly using the term "about," Representative.
Gotcha.
But anyway, and then the fifth part is to set the assumed interest rate for the calculation of the money match annuity at 4% instead of 8%. This again would reduce PERS costs by about somewhere between $1.8 and $2 billion. They're not independent of one another because each one of them moves the other part a little bit. So we're still working with the PERS people to come up with that answer.
Maybe Representative Johnson, do you have anything you'd like to add on this?
Well, from the public education perspective, I'm concerned about what the proposal lays out by the co-chairs because in many ways I think it instills a false hope, especially in the regards to the K-12 budget, because it's built up, as you said, Representative Richardson, it's built on the assumption that the legislature is going to want to raise taxes in the midst of what I think is still a very troubling economy, and I guess assumes that Oregon's economy is healthy enough that we can begin to tax the private sector again, and maybe an 8.5% unemployment rate is the new status quo for Oregon. I would think that's probably the assumption, but more than that, on regards to the PERS, the thing that gets overlooked so often is that within the K-12 world of school district budgets, we tend to look at how much revenue is the legislature going to give us. The question that doesn't get asked often enough is what kind of relief is the legislature going to give us from the cost constraints? And I'm talking about this not just as a legislature, but as a school board member in Hood River County. In our local district this next year, unless the PERS reform occurs, 32% of our employee personnel costs are going to have to be redirected back to PERS, and it takes money out of that budget that we can't use for acquisition of teachers or for classroom-related expenses. So we have to address the cost constraints because that really is what's hamstringing our entire public education budget. I'm really concerned about what this budget does for higher ed. I sit on higher ed last year, as you know. I co-chaired higher ed with Michael Dembro, but this budget leaves both our community colleges and our university system poor because there's less in the way of PERS reform, and it assumes the governor's recommended budget for them. They already, what he was forecasting an increase for both community colleges and for the universities was not enough to cover the projected PERS rate increase for 2013. This budget leaves them lacking even that sort of cover that he was going to give them. So I've already heard from community college and workforce development people, from my university presidents and so forth, that they're very concerned where they are left in this equation, because I think it's problematic. And this is not a budget that I think is going to enable our system to continue to make progress towards 40-40-20. It's just very hard for me to foresee that this is a sustainable budget, because it doesn't address the underlying problems, which really are the cost constraints. Money you save with PERS reform this biennium will save you money next biennium as well. And we don't have to play that roller coaster of how much money's in the general fund each and every biennium. So that's where I come from, but I'm very concerned what it does for public education.
Thank you. It's one of those situations where you have good news and bad news. The good news from the governor's recommended budget is we're going to give you more money, and the bad news is it's not going to be enough to cover the increase in PERS expenses. So it's a net loss.
Why did you choose to support the OSBA PERS reform proposal and not Bruce Hanna's package? He also had a pretty comprehensive reform package, so why did you go with this one?
We went with it because we felt that it was presented not as a Republican solution, although the suggestions that Bruce Hanna gives are excellent. We also had a number of PERS bills from Senator Whitsitt, but we're not going with his because we're not looking for a Republican versus Democrat. This is not a political issue. The cost of PERS is a statewide issue. It's nonpartisan, it's dramatic, and it's ever increasing. And if the school boards want to come forward with an idea on how to address it, then we're fine with looking at them, because they're not saying that it's going to be a partisan solution. It is the best solution that their consultants were able to come up with.
The PERS issue is not just a school issue or a state government issue. Every public employer in the state of Oregon is getting eaten alive by the cost of PERS. And many of those public employers are also paying about a 6.25% Social Security. So if we're looking at a 26% PERS contribution for the 13-15 biennium, then you add 6.25%, you're looking at almost a third of payroll. Some of these districts are paying already up to 32. Now we're approaching 40% of payroll. It's not sustainable. It has to be fixed.
What's really also important is, as you look at any budget where they have PERS employees, the OSBA proposed PERS savings will lift all boats. I mean, that tide will lift all boats, because anyone that has PERS payments will benefit from these reductions. We point out K-12 because that is such an obvious comparison point. But these benefits and this PERS reform will affect a reduction in PERS costs for all PERS employees.
Dick, you had a question?
Yeah. When you're talking about the OSB plan, were you, any of you or your colleagues or staff involved in working with the OSBA on that plan?
There was conversations that took place with all the various plans. It was primarily a discussion took place between the PERS director and his staff, the PERS actuaries, and OSB and their attorneys. I mean,
were you folks involved in making suggestions in what they did or anything?
I can't answer that personally because I was not. There was some conversation that I'm aware of with some of our members as to suggestions as to what we would be happy with, but the suggestions that they made were ones that came to us, not from us.
What would you cut? The number that the Democrats have put out there in terms of reducing tax credits or eliminating tax credits is too high. What number do you guys have in your budget in terms of new revenue from imposing tax credits? Is it just zero?
It is zero. Our budget is based on the current revenue increase of $1.7 billion. We do not need to raise taxes. We don't have a need to bring in more revenue when you have such an egregious amount of PERS increases and debt servicing increases. If we address those expenditures, then we will have sufficient revenue to put us on a course where we can grow at a rate equal to or better than inflation increases, population increases. And there has to be a time when you don't just say, spend everything you get and hope that there will be enough when the next recession comes, because it hasn't worked for us in the past.
But isn't that going to make a budget compromise exceedingly difficult at this point?
Absolutely. But so is the recommendations of the co-chairs when they say, we're going to give you PERS light increases, and somehow that's going to be okay. And we're going to have $275 million of tax increases. So which is the heavier load? We would love to coordinate and compromise on a budget, but that wasn't what was offered to us. And so what we're doing now is saying, here's what we would have been saying if we were at the table. And it might have changed the appearance of the co-chair's budget had we been there.
Where would you cut in human services?
Pardon me?
Where would you reduce money in human services in order to shift some of it to education?
You know, there's over 100 programs in human services, and it's going to be up to the subcommittees to take the allocations, to work through the various budgets, and then come in with whatever the appropriate places to make these adjustments would be. That's how the system is supposed to work. I mean, the co-chairs come in and say, okay, here's what we've got, here's our guiding principles, here's how much money you're going to get, and you divide that up, make allocations to your 6 subcommittees, and then the next 2 to 3 months, the subcommittees work through these various budgets to determine how you can meet the revenue that you have available.
To follow up on Jonathan's question, however, Representative Richardson, you headed that subcommittee, I believe, 8 years ago, and you found that you were often a prisoner of the caseloads that.
Yeah, so we have.
So how do you explain a 4% increase when the caseloads, several of them, are still fairly high from the recession?
There's been a memo that we've been in recovery since 2009. So when you're in recovery, caseloads should be decreasing. We find it an anomaly to think that the caseloads and the costs and the number of employees continue to go up, even though we've got $1.7 billion of additional revenue. And so in times of recovery, the excuse that we just needed these additional caseloads, monies for caseloads, is just that. It's an excuse. There has to come a time when you reevaluate what you can afford and bring down this increase of 44% in just a few budgets to a growth line that is in harmony with the revenue.
You have to also think that, you know, with the combined Oregon Health Authority and DHS budget is what, a little over $20 billion. 1% of $20 billion is what, 200 million? So, I mean, you just have to shave a little bit here and a little bit there to save real money in a budget that big. And again, certainly that's what the public safety subcommittees do. That's what the human services subcommittees do. But you try to look for a little here and a little there. But when you're going to save a significant amount of money, you have to go where the money is.
That's true.
If it's a time of recovery and therefore it might be appropriate to start cutting HHS because caseloads have been reduced, then if it's a time of recovery, wouldn't it be the appropriate time to talk about ending some of the tax expenditures that the Democrats want to do since the private sector is improving?
We're willing to discuss anything if we were involved in the discussion. But to merely have it presented that this is going to happen, that's not compromise. That's back into the way that things were before. What we're looking to do is to say we have sufficient revenue to balance the budget. Now the hard work comes in, and that is to have the subcommittees make it work.
Thank you. I want to thank Representative Richardson and Senator Whitsitt for their hard work on producing the Republicans' budget. We're hoping that you will do a side-by-side comparison between the budget that was produced in an echo chamber, that is to say the co-chair's budget, and look at a real comparison that offers a different direction, we think better outcomes. We're finished for today. Thank you very much for your questions.
One last thing now, the Democrats and the Democratic governor offer a fairly substantial PERS reform, and you guys kind of thumb your nose at it and say, no, you got to go one bigger?
$400 million of PERS reform that's been offered by the co-chairs is not even sufficient to address the increase in PERS in the next 2 years. What we need is real PERS reform, not merely PERS light, making it look like you're doing something that really has no lasting benefit to bring down the cost of PERS in a way that will allow us, as a state, to reemphasize education and other areas that are driving priorities. Thank you.
Certainly, the $1.1 billion in 11-13 and the $900 million in 13-15 and nearly $700 million in 15-17 comes out to $2.7 billion, which isn't covered by a $400 million reduction.